Have you ever wondered how you even begin to challenge a settled interpretation of the Bible? I mean, one that stood for nearly 2 millennia? Well, today we're diving into exactly that. We're investigating a 1900-year-old consensus and looking at the methodological warrant for reopening 2 Corinthians 12. We're digging into a source document that asks a seemingly impossible question. Is it actually possible that the entire Christian tradition has misidentified the man in Christ mentioned by the Apostle Paul for 1900 years? And if so, how on earth do you even go about proving something like that? Let's get right into it. We are going to treat the source material like a true investigatory brief. Here's our roadmap for the journey. First, the 19th century consensus. Second, method over credentials. Third, inherited versus tested knowledge. Fourth, weighing the evidence. Fifth, the stakes in the tool. And finally, number 6, the ultimate ask. All right, section 1, the 19th century consensus, and what we might call the strongest objection to this whole investigation. Before we can even peek at a single Greek word, the source document insists we have to confront the massive roadblock standing in our way, and we need to hear this objection at its absolute strongest. Here's the hurdle. For 1,900 years, there has been an unbroken, universal agreement that the man Paul refers to in 2 Corinthians 12 is, well, Paul himself. Think about that for a second. From the early church fathers like Chrysostom, all the way through the Reformation, right up to the modern critical scholars working today, the reading has literally remained entirely unchanged. 19 centuries of readers, all looking at the exact same original Greek, have landed on the exact same conclusion, no deviation. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the sheer crushing weight of the objection. We are talking about thousands of fractured, disagreeing denominations that cannot agree on baptism, they can't agree on church government, or, even the age of the earth. Yet they all universally agree on this one single point. This consensus survived the great schism between the East and the West. It remained totally untouched by fierce, centuries-long debates over papal primacy and predestination. The source makes a great point here. Christian bodies today agree on scarcely anything else. So you have to ask, who, looking honestly at that deeply fractured historical record, has the standing to reopen this one uniquely unified case? Which brings us right to section 2, method over credentials, and the big question of who can actually reopen it. So, who exactly does have the standing to reopen a case that's been firmly shut for 17 centuries? Does it require a credentialed scholar with an endowed university chair and a massive academic press behind them? I mean, if a mere working paper proposes that this much inherited certainty rests on a huge error, why on earth should anyone listen? Well, the author argues that standing doesn't come from a fancy title. It comes from the investigative method itself. And there is a brilliant, brilliant irony here. You see, 2 Corinthians 12 is precisely about how spiritual significance isn't rationed out by official titles. The source notes that Paul's argument in this very passage is aimed directly at super-apostles who try to make revelation into a credential, a mark of rank. So if the biblical text itself argues that standing before God isn't a function of institutional weight, then demanding institutional credentials just to interpret that text, that would literally be smuggling back in the exact system the passage is trying to dismantle. It's wild, right? So the warrant to reopen this case belongs strictly to the method. Every claim must be checkable, every citation traceable. The method asks nothing to be trusted, but it asks absolutely everything to be checked. Moving on to section 3, inherited versus tested knowledge. This is where we dive into how we actually know what we know. Because let's say we grant that a rigorous method gives someone the right to ask the question. Fair enough. But we are still left with a massive, glaring puzzle. If the method is so sound, why hasn't anyone else found this answer in 1900 years? It comes down to a vital difference between inheriting an answer and independently verifying it. The source makes this fascinating distinction between instrumental knowledge and relational knowledge. Instrumental knowledge is inherited, it's highly useful, but it's totally unexamined. It's kind of like knowing that 2 + 2 = 4 without ever needing to derive it from first principles, or knowing how to spell a word without having a clue about its deep historical etymology. Relational knowledge, on the flip side, is derived, it's tested, and it's entirely rebuildable from the ground up, even if the received answer just vanished tomorrow. Human cognition absolutely relies on instrumental knowledge to function. We have to. But this highlights a really vital point. Mere unanimity doesn't necessarily mean a question was ever actually tested. It might just mean 19 centuries of readers received the answer from the reader right before them and simply never had a reason to rederive it themselves. Okay, section 4, weighing the evidence using historical control cases. To prove that this 1900-year consensus might just be untested instrumental knowledge, the source introduces 3 really fascinating control cases from church history. Let's take a look at how the tradition historically handles things when a question actually is put to the test. Look at what happened when the tradition opened and tested a huge question, like the birth date of Jesus, its own central figure. They worked from a genuine lack of historical data, and what happened? They visibly split along the lines of their reasoning. The West landed on December, parts of the East landed on January, and the Armenian Church keeps January 6 to this very day. The source points out that this is exactly what a tested question looks like in the historical record. The tradition fractures along the lines of actual reasoning, and we see the exact same thing happen with baptism, polity, and the sacraments. Yet, when we turn back to 2 Corinthians 12, something incredibly strange happens. When asked why Paul used the third person to describe this man, saying, "I know a man in Christ," instead of just saying, "I was caught up," the tradition offers at least 6 wildly different and sometimes flat-out incompatible rationales. Think about it. Chrysostom and Wesley, they say it was modesty. John Calvin says no, it wasn't modesty, it was compulsion, that Paul was stammering. Modern critical scholars call it a deliberate literary strategy, while the History of Religion school writes it off as an unreflective genre convention. You even have Lutheran readings arguing one thing and charismatic readings arguing something completely different. As the source highlights, modesty and compulsion literally cannot both describe Paul's motive at the exact same time. A deliberate strategy and an unreflective convention cannot both be true. It's a mess. So, this contrast is really the visual climax of the whole argument. Look at this. On the left, the conclusion hasn't moved an inch in 19 centuries. Everyone just agrees Paul is the man. But on the right side, the reasoning behind it has constantly shifted, fractured, and contradicted itself. The author argues that this is precisely what happens when each generation inherits a settled answer and then just invents a reason to fit it based on whatever their own era's theological grammar happens to be. The agreement is massive, sure, but the constantly shifting rationale proves the conclusion was simply inherited, passed down the line, and never actually opened and tested. The source suggests, and this is key, that this is exactly the environment where historical error would survive the longest and be noticed the absolute last. Now for Section 5, the stakes and the tool, and why this kind of precision really matters. At this point, you might be wondering, why does this level of textual precision actually matter? I mean, if the tradition has survived just fine for centuries reading Paul as the man in 2 Corinthians 12, why rock the boat now? Is this all just an exercise in academic trivia? Definitely not. According to the source, Paul himself set the standard with this specific Greek word, orthotomio. Originally, it was a road builder's word. It meant to cut a path straight, without any deviation. The goal was to ensure a traveler arrives exactly at the destination, not just roughly in the neighborhood. The author points out that Paul and Peter didn't treat the inaccurate handling of revealed truth as some simple scholarly slip-up. No, Paul actually warns that bad doctrine spreads like gangrene, corrupting the tissue around it by degrees until the damage is painfully visible. Because of this, declining to check an inherited answer simply because it's been around a long time, that is incredibly risky. The stakes here are accuracy itself. So how do we actually proceed safely? To weigh the upcoming evidence fairly without just seeing imaginary connections in mere noise, the investigator uses a rigorous intelligence rule. Human minds are basically pattern-seeking machines, heavily biased toward finding meaning in total random chance. To combat this, the source outlines a strict discipline. A single correlation? That's just a coincidence. A second correlation? Okay, that earns notice. By the third, if it occurs completely independently, a careful reader really should suspect a common cause. And when you hit 4 or more correlations, each from a genuinely separate, independent line of evidence, at that point, refusing to consider a connection actually starts to cost you more credibility than simply considering it. So the reader is being asked to rigorously weigh whether proposed connections are truly independent, or if they could just be explained away by simple chance. Which brings us finally to Section 6, the ultimate ask, running the test. We've laid it all out. We've seen the massive 1,900-year-old objection, the method that bypasses the need for institutional credentials, the vital difference between just inheriting knowledge and actually testing it, and the strict tools required for the investigation ahead. So what happens if we finally run the test? Listen, this isn't asking to destroy a 1,900-year-old tradition. The source is absolutely crystal clear about that. If the test is run and the traditional reading survives it, hey, the tradition is infinitely better off. It moves from merely being an inherited assumption to finally being a verified fact. But what if it doesn't survive? We are left with this incredibly provocative thought. Are we willing to finally run the test with an open book, applying rigorous historical and textual scrutiny? And if we do actually run that test, what incredible, long-buried truth might we recover?
It is a bold invitation to derive just for once an answer that we have only ever blindly received.